On a Saturday night in 1890, two rival gangs faced each other in the streets of Ancoats, Manchester. They weren't hardened criminals or professional thieves. They were teenagers, some as young as 14, dressed in bell-bottom trousers, peaked caps, and heavy clogs with brass tips on the toes. They carried belt buckles sharpened into weapons, knives, and stones wrapped in handkerchiefs. These were the Scuttlers, Britain's first organised youth gang culture, and for 30 years they turned Manchester and Salford into a battlefield where working-class boys fought brutal territorial wars over streets, music halls, and pride. Between 1870 and 1900, thousands of young men and even young women joined gangs with names like the Bengal Tigers, the Meadow Lads, the She-Battery Mob, and the 40 Row. They fought pitched battles that could involve up to 100 combatants, leaving victims with slashed faces, broken bones, and sometimes death. Police struggled to control them. Newspapers called them a moral crisis, and the authorities tried everything from harsh sentences to youth clubs to break the cycle. Welcome to Clyde, Crooks, where forgotten gang wars and underworld histories get dragged back into the light. If you want more stories of real gangs, real blood, and real consequences, subscribe and ring the bell. New episodes drop 4 times a week. The Scuttlers emerged in Manchester and Salford during the 1870s, a period of rapid industrial growth and desperate urban poverty. Manchester was the world's first industrial city, a place where cotton mills, factories, and warehouses dominated the landscape, and working-class families lived packed into slums with no running water, no sanitation, and no hope. Children worked 12-hour shifts in factories from the age of 8. Families of 6 or 7 people shared single rooms. Life expectancy in the poorest districts was under 30 years. For the young men growing up in this environment, there was little future beyond factory work, poverty, and an early death. But there was one thing they could control: their territory, their reputation, and their gang. The name Scuttler came from the way they fought, scuttling away quickly after attacking their opponents. They operated in clearly defined territories across Manchester and Salford, with each gang claiming specific streets, neighbourhoods, and pubs as their own. Cross into the wrong territory, wearing the wrong colours or the wrong style of cap, and you were asking for a beating. The gangs had distinctive identities built around their neighbourhoods. The Bengal Tigers came from the Bengal Street area and wore red scarves. The Angel Meadow Lads, sometimes called the 40 Row, controlled one of Manchester's most notorious slums. The Adelphi Mob, the Ordsall Lane Gang, the Hope Street Gang, and dozens of others carved up the city between them. These weren't loose collections of friends hanging out on corners. They were organised groups with leaders, rules, and a culture all their own. The Scuttlers were instantly recognisable by their fashion. They wore bell-bottom trousers, often 14 or 16 inches wide at the ankle, which distinguished them from respectable working men. They wore heavy clogs with brass tips on the toes, which became weapons in street fights. They wore peaked caps tilted to one side, with the peaks sometimes pulled low over one eye. Many wore silk scarves in their gang colours, neckerchiefs, and brass-studded leather belts. Their hair was cut in a distinctive style called a donkey fringe, shaved at the back and sides with a long fringe at the front. This look was deliberate, a uniform that marked them as Scuttlers and told everyone which gang they belonged to. When they walked through the streets in groups, they walked with a swagger, singing gang songs and looking for trouble. Violence was central to Scuttler culture. Gang fights, known as scuttles, could erupt over anything: a perceived insult, a girl, territory, or simply encountering rivals in the wrong place at the wrong time. These weren't fist fights. Scuttlers used weapons. They carried knives, belt buckles filed down to sharp points, stones wrapped in handkerchiefs that could be swung like medieval flails, and their brass-tipped clogs, which could break bones when used to kick fallen opponents. Some carried revolvers, though these were rare. The fights themselves could involve anywhere from a handful of combatants to pitched battles with up to 100 young men on each side. They took place in the streets, in pubs, outside music halls, and in parks. Victims were slashed across the face, a signature scuttler move designed to leave permanent scars. Others were kicked unconscious and left in the gutter. A few died. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in 1890, when the Bengal Tigers clashed with a rival gang in Ancoats. The fight started outside a music hall and spilled into the streets, with dozens of young men armed with belts, knives, and stones attacking each other. Police intervened, but were overwhelmed by the numbers and the ferocity of the violence. Several scuttlers were arrested, but many escaped, and those who were caught received harsh sentences. The newspapers covered the incident extensively, describing the scuttlers as a threat to civilized society and calling for stronger measures to control them. But the violence didn't stop. If anything, the publicity made the gangs more notorious, which only increased their appeal to young men looking for status and excitement. Women played a role in scuttler culture too, though they were fewer in number. Some female gangs existed, most notably the she-battery mob, who fought alongside male scuttlers and sometimes fought their own battles. Female gang members wore their own version of the scuttler style, clogs, shawls, and distinctive hairstyles. They could be just as violent as their male counterparts, using hairpins, stones, and their clogs as weapons. They also served as lookouts, carried weapons for the men to avoid police searches, and participated in the gang culture of music halls, pubs, and street life. Their presence shocked Victorian society, which expected young women to be demure and domestic, not street fighters in brass-tipped clogs. The police struggled to control the scuttlers. Manchester and Salford had relatively small police forces for cities of their size, and officers were often outnumbered and outmatched when facing large gangs. Scuttlers operated in their own neighborhoods, where they had support from the community, making arrests difficult. Witnesses refused to testify out of fear or loyalty. Even when arrests were made, convictions were hard to secure. The courts tried harsh sentences, sending young scuttlers to prison for months or even years, but this did little to deter the gangs. In fact, prison time often increased a scuttler's reputation. Some police officers developed reputations for being tough on the gangs, but they faced constant danger. Scuttlers ambushed officers, attacked them in groups, and targeted those known for cracking down on gang activity. The peak of scuttler activity came in the 1880s and early 1890s. During this period, newspapers regularly reported on gang fights, arrests, and court cases. The Manchester Guardian, the Salford Chronicle, and other local papers ran stories about the scuttler menace, often with sensational headlines and moral outrage. In the first year of serious police crackdowns, over 500 scuttlers were arrested. The courts handed down sentences ranging from fines to months of hard labor. But the gangs persisted. New members replaced those who were imprisoned or grew out of gang life. The culture was too deeply embedded in working-class youth identity to be easily broken. What finally reduced scuttler violence wasn't harsh policing or long prison sentences. It was the creation of alternatives. In the 1890s, churches and social reformers began opening lads' clubs and boys' clubs across Manchester and Salford. These clubs offered young men places to go besides the streets, activities besides fighting, and a sense of belonging that didn't require violence. They organized sports, particularly football, which gave working-class boys an outlet for their competitive energy. One of these clubs, the West Gorton St. Mark's Church Lads Club, founded in 1880, eventually became Manchester City Football Club. Football became a way for young men to channel the same territorial loyalty and physical aggression that had fueled gang violence into something socially acceptable. By the late 1890s, scuttler violence was declining. By 1900, the gangs had largely faded, replaced by a new generation that found their identity in football clubs and working men's organizations rather than street gangs. But the Scuttlers left a legacy. They were Britain's first modern youth gang culture, predating the Peaky Blinders of Birmingham by more than a decade. They established patterns that would be repeated by later gangs: territorial control, distinctive fashion, violence as a rite of passage, and a subculture that offered identity and status to young men who had little else. The moral panic around the Scuttlers also established patterns. Newspapers blamed bad parenting, lack of discipline, music halls, and working-class culture in general. Authorities debated whether harsh punishment or social reform was the answer. Politicians called for crackdowns, and reformers argued that giving young people alternatives was more effective than simply locking them up. These debates continue today whenever youth gang violence makes headlines. The story of the Scuttlers matters because it shows that gang culture isn't a modern problem imported from other countries. It's deeply rooted in British working-class history. The Scuttlers emerged from specific conditions: poverty, overcrowding, child labor, lack of opportunity, and communities where violence was normalized. They created their own culture because the mainstream culture offered them nothing. They fought over territory because territory was the only thing they could control. They built their identity around their gang because their gang was the only institution that valued them. And they engaged in violence not because they were inherently bad, but because violence was the currency of status in their world. Decades later, when the Peaky Blinders emerged in Birmingham, they followed a similar pattern: distinctive fashion, territorial control, violence, and a subculture built around working-class youth identity. The difference was that the Peaky Blinders operated in the early 20th century, when the lessons of the Scuttlers had already been learned. By then, authorities knew that football clubs, boys' clubs, and social programs were more effective than mass arrests. But the fundamental conditions that created the Scuttlers and the Peaky Blinders remained: poverty, lack of opportunity, and young men looking for identity and status in a world that offered them neither. The Scuttlers are gone, their bell-bottom trousers and brass-tipped clogs now museum pieces, their gang songs forgotten. But their story is a blueprint for understanding every youth gang culture that followed. Different cities, different eras, different fashions, but the same fundamental logic. When society offers young people nothing, they create their own cultures, their own rules, and their own ways of mattering. And when those cultures turn violent, the solution isn't just punishment. It's offering real alternatives that give young people identity, belonging, and a future worth choosing over the streets. This is just one chapter in Britain's hidden underworld history. If you want more stories like this, from medieval outlaw armies to Glasgow's razor gangs, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which gang story you want next. This is Clyde Crooks. See you in the next war.